Okay, thank you, Olivier. It's very tempting on the eve of a major European Parliament vote to go into the text of the legislation, but I'm going to refrain from a line-by-line critique of the legislation and take a little bit of a step back. And I just want to remind you all why Transparency International is so interested in this topic of money laundering. Corruption around the world is facilitated by people's ability to launder and hide the proceeds of corruption. In particular, grand corruption, that looting of national resources by public officials that is still so depressingly common in many parts of the world. This grand corruption cannot take place without access to banks, lawyers, accountants, other service providers that are mainly located here in the so-called developed world. So that's the first thing to recognize. This is very much our problem. This is our responsibility. And I want to give it a vivid example of the kind of grand corruption that I'm talking about. Following the Arab Spring a number of years ago, Swiss authorities identified approximately $1 billion in bank accounts linked to autocrats like Mubarak from Egypt, Ben Ali from Tunisia, Gaddafi from Libya, and others. Now, the Swiss authorities got a lot of praise, and quite rightly, for acting so swiftly to freeze these accounts and try and return it to the owners. But the question I think that should have been asked is, how did any bank that operated standard KYC, know your customer principles, allow that money to be deposited in the bank in the first place? If a bank knows, as was the case, that Mubarak's official public salary was $800 per month, how can he or his known associates deposit over 40 million Swiss francs in accounts? And these are not isolated examples. In 2011 alone, the developing world lost almost 1 trillion in illicit financial flows. Now, that's not all corruption, that's also tax evasion and other crimes. But the trend seems to be that it's getting worse. So that was an increase of over 14% in 2010. Now, the UN estimates that the global detection rate for illicit funds is about 1% of criminal proceeds, and the seizure rate is as low as 0.2%. So once this money gets into the system, it's effectively lost, and the probability of it being returned to its rightful owner is negligible. So the key to all of this is prevention. And the question, I suppose, is how well are we doing at prevention? The Swiss bank example suggests not very well. But a less anecdotal source would suggest even more shocking pictures. So a study by the UK's Financial Services Authority in 2011 looked into how UK banks manage high money laundering risk situations. And they found, I think it's fair to say, catastrophic failings. 1/3 of banks failed to take adequate measures to verify the beneficial owners of their customers. 1/3 of banks, including the private banking arms of many major banking groups, appeared willing to accept very high levels of money laundering if the immediate reputational risk was not too high. 3/4 of the banks in the sample failed to take adequate measures to establish the legitimacy of the source of the funds to be used in the business relationship. And over half of the banks visited failed to apply meaningful enhanced due diligence measures in higher risk situations, such as when the client was a PEP or politically exposed person. So the question is, why have banks and other financial services professionals failed to carry out these basic due diligence obligations? Is it because they don't have the right tools to verify the identity of the owners, for example, or because it was expedient not to do so? Well, let's give banks and others the benefit of the doubt for the moment. And it's true, as we have been discussing, that a critical part of the problem is the lack of information collected and published on those who ultimately own and control companies, trusts, and other legal structures. This information on beneficial ownership is essential to allow banks and others to do their due diligence. And the problem is that the true beneficial owner is often obscured, as you probably well know, by layers of shell companies, trusts, and other opaque legal entities. Now, Dr. Cairns at the outset has described the situation very well. His remarks were focused a little bit on tax avoidance and terrorist financing, but the World Bank did a report a number of years ago and found that in 150 high-level cases of corruption, 800 corporate vehicles were involved, laundering a total of more than 50 billion. So for that reason, Transparency International very much supports the creation of these public registers for companies, for trusts, and for other legal structures in the EU in order to fight financial crime and corruption effectively. We think making the information public is not only cost effective, according to the Commission's own calculations, but it would also improve the quality of the information made available by allowing many more individuals to look at the information and spot discrepancies and mistakes. It would allow companies to know who they're doing business with, so it would enhance their due diligence measures. And it would allow civil society, journalists, citizens, and others around the EU and in developing countries to have access to this information. Few EU jurisdictions collect this kind of information or require these entities to share the information with national authorities, and no country makes this information freely available to the public. So if, as it looks likely, this proposal passes the European Parliament tomorrow, it will be a truly groundbreaking piece of legislation and a major blow against corruption. Should this be left to EU legislation? Could member states not do this themselves? Well, not according to the OECD. They found that 16 of the 21 EU countries that are members of the Financial Action Task Force are either non-compliant or partially compliant with recommendations on beneficial ownership and of other legal arrangements as well. Now, I mean, beneficial ownership is not a silver bullet, and of course, all of this assumes that all the banks are missing is accurate and reliable information to do their job. But it's an open question whether the risk-reward ratio in banks gives them the right incentives, in particular whether incentives for turning away customers if they don't know what the source of the funds are, or if there are adequate sanctions when the rules are breached. And I can go into more detail on this in the discussion. Now, I don't want to add to the bank bashing, which is quite fashionable at the moment, unnecessarily. And I know we have representatives of the banking industry here in the audience. And I think it's only fair to say that this whole issue is not limited to banks. And we shouldn't forget that money laundering also includes the conversion of illicit money into legitimate wealth through the purchase of real estate, business entities, art, etc. So art and jewellery merchants, real estate agents, lawyers are all possible enablers and equally subject to anti-money laundering regulations. Some of the most blatant anti-money laundering cases recently have shown how corrupt politicians and their entourage are able to purchase high-value art, luxury cars, and real estate with relative ease. My own favourite example was from a number of years ago, and Barclays was revealed to have allowed Teodorin Obiang, who's the son of the president of Equatorial Guinea, to purchase 18 million euros of art auctioned from the estate of the late Yves Saint Laurent through an Obiang-controlled company held with the bank. Now, Teodorin is also, according to the record, an impoverished civil servant with a salary of about $6,000 a month as a minister in his father's government, and yet he is renowned for his luxurious tastes, not only in art, but having a $35 million mansion in California. Now, again, as with the banking sector, the solution here is, in part, making information on beneficial ownership accessible, available to agents, to those agents, real estate agents, art dealers and others, and improving the quality through public access. For me, that's the beauty of these transparency measures. It allows private actors, such as banks, public actors, such as law enforcement authorities, and civil society actors to work together to achieve a common aim, which is to fight crime and corruption. So I'll leave it there, and we can take up that in discussion, hopefully.